It seems to me, post-awakening, that much of what I used to imagine was free will, in inverted commas, or personal agency, was in fact choices being made and actions occurring that were based on habits, family systems, ancestral influences, unconscious archetypal patterns, what Jungian would call complexes, and yes, even I suppose some scars. Post-awakening, it felt as if a massive instant dissolving of all of these elements happened, and for several months I rested in a state of sublime peace and delight, with no motivation at all to do in inverted commas, anything in the world. It was both utter stillness and at the same time what I call the end of suffering. Nothing bothered me at all, ever, and that is still 80% true. Very little moves me to upset. The motiveless state eventually gave way to stirrings of creative inspiration. The last 2 years, post-awakening, have been the most muse-driven and prolific of my life as a writer. They have also been the most synchronicity-filled 2 years of my life. Here is my bottom line question. What is the role of motivation in the actions we take to create outcomes in our lives once the majority, if not all, of our former patterns have dissolved? Do we have free will, or only the illusion of it? What moves us once the self has been seen as the self? This confusion stems from seeing the teachings of someone like Bentino Massaro, who seems to be saying once we wake up to true nature, we get to play like godlets, creating what we wish in the world, a kind of the secret for the enlightenment crowd. In his teaching, he seems to suggest it's a big game or play, and we have utter freedom to choose and create outcomes, and that there is only ourself to blame if life circumstances do not please us. This is a long question, and not nearly as clear and succinct as I would like, and so may not fit for the webinar. So essentially this was the question, which I find very, very important because it touches upon the fundamental question of free will. And the free will question is essentially the question of all philosophies. Does or doesn't? Does it exist or it doesn't? Does it exist partially? Does it exist at all? And if it does, on what grounds? On what premises? If there is only one doer, how can there be any will on the part of the one who is even a co-creator? So we're going to look into this. Now, before going to the core of that question, right? Before going to the very essence of that question, I'd like to comment on something which this questioner brings up with crystal clarity, and that is the motiveless state eventually gave way to stirrings, right? And the question here, for instance, is that how come, what is the role of motivation in the actions we take to create outcomes in our lives once the majority, if not all, of our former patterns have dissolved? Do we have free will or only the illusion of it? First of all, it is very important to understand that it is not that all the former patterns have been dissolved. This is one of the very, very common understandings. What is dissolved is the frictional response to the patterns, which is not the same as patterns themselves. In other words, what gets dissolved in the process of true awakening and expansion of consciousness, in the process of self-realization, it's that, let's say, those latent psychic impressions, right, which the questioner called samskaras or vasanas, what have you. But dissolved vasanas, or dissolved psychic patterns, dissolved psychic conditionings are not disappearing entirely. What disappears is our psychic response to them. So if before a situation, an experience would trigger a complete involvement with that, what we've experienced, a complete involvement on whatever level, mental, emotional, psychological, what have you, on a level of the action taking, that itself instantaneously creates cause and effect. So the karma is set in motion. And that's what really, really is known in like spirituality born in the Indian subcontinent. It is known as the wheel of samsara. You know, that action, reaction, experience, you know, seed sown, and then it have to be re-experienced again as action, reaction, and experience. So here, this response simply goes, but the actual pattern not necessarily dissolves with that. And you can see a lot of people who have truly profound awakening, truly profound phases of transformation, and they still have that, let's say, these traces or trades that were known, or they were known by previously, still exhibiting these traits. And people say, well, how can you be, you know, enlightened so and so if you still do this and act like this and speak like that? Well, that's precisely because there is this vasanas, they're working themselves out, but they no longer hold any sway. So this is a tremendous difference. They no longer have any lasting, let's say, potency. It's as there's an example in the scriptures. The seeds have been roasted. So the seeds are still there, and we taste the seeds because they're there, but they cannot produce crops. So I hope that makes it clear. So the seeds of our previous actions and impressions are there, but they're not potent any longer. So this, in as much as the patterns and the behavior. So this should answer the first part of the question, because not all awakenings incapacitate us from what we used to do in life. Very often life continues as it was. In the same way, like in a Zen proverb, you know, what have you, drawing water, chopping wood, you know, so nothing really changed. You're carrying on doing the same stuff you've been doing before. But it fails to overpower or overshadow that what is actually taking place as a very different qualitative experience altogether. So now we move to the that core of that question. So do we have that as a free will, or is it only an illusion? And the last paragraph, the question adds, is that the confusion stems from seeing the teachings of likes of Bentinho Massaro, who seems to be saying, once awakened up to to the true nature, we get to play like godlets, creating what we wish in the world. A kind of the secret, in inverted commas, for the enlightenment crowd. Well, first of all, I'm not a connoisseur of Bentinho Massaro's teaching. I've only met him briefly and recorded, or helped to record his interview with Rick Archer for the Bad Gap. I personally do not buy, or I do not share that platform that we become like godlets. It is very, very premature to say that awakening itself, or even self-realization to a degree, can create that possibility when we are embedded with that, what is known in, let's say, tantric tradition, and specifically in Kashmir Shaivism, the quality of svatantriya. Svatantriya is that aspect of consciousness which is the sole property of Shiva as pure awareness of the Absolute itself and the Godhead. So that's svatantriya. It's the only quality that the Kashmir Shaiva teachers and philosophies state that that's the only quality that Jiva as Shiva does not possess. What it means is that human is capable of realizing divine to a highest degree. However, it is not in his capacity to, let's say, create another universe out of nothing. That is the sole property of Shiva only. So whether we agree with that or not, to say that awakening itself brings that possibility of just going through life and creates whatever we want and create whatever we want is, in my opinion, an immature statement. However, that said, I immediately want to add that it gets as close to that, what is known as the play of consciousness or lila, when we are completely merged, when the subject and object totally dissolve in each other, and one abides in a state of unity permanently, then there is a possibility, spontaneous possibility, that anything that rises within that state, and within that state still, that bubbling of consciousness, that throb of consciousness, it is in the very nature of consciousness itself. It moves and it moves not. That's the very principle of spanda. It's that finest vibration, finest throb, the quiver within the heart of consciousness. Yet it's not a movement as such. It's not a physical or subtle movement. It's way infinitely more subtle than that. So that within that there is a possibility rises. And for the enlightened one, for the one who abides in the unity consciousness, there is this playfulness, because that what was perceived in the world as Maya prior to that, that was what's perceived in the world, let's say, as all imposing, let's say, this reality, whether this reality was conceived or perceived as illusion or it was perceived as real, there was this limitation to that, because experience itself was limiting. In that enlightened state, in the state of unity, there is that quality of consciousness is transformed, or the quality of veiled consciousness as Maya is transformed into the quality of Lila, a sheer play. So there is recognition that everything is in its right place, and one becomes a willing participant of that play. One simply enjoys that play. So from there on, life is Lila. It's the ordeal has been taken out of life. It has energy of its own. It rolls over. It rock and rolls on its own without us moving a finger. This is something Maharishi Mahesh Yogi emphasized in many of his expositions and many of his lectures, notoriously in the Science of Creative Intelligence, that we need to bring our awareness at that ultimate level, at that foundational, fundamental level of consciousness, where we spontaneously come in alignment with that bubbling impulse of creativity, where it at the level of where the wave breaks into a particle and spontaneously manifest everything in our life that comes simply from that level of pure intention and coherence. However, to say that all awakenings bring that, it's certainly a confusion, because that state of unity is a deemed rare state. Still, with all these thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of awakening going on today, the state of unity is still singular and grand events on the level of humanity. Let's not forget that. Very traditional outlook, but I prefer to actually understand and measure this process in terms of its sequential unfoldment, so that we don't suddenly get lost in some kind of wild place of the mind, even in that post-awakening state. So how does that, all of that sits with the concept of free will? Do we have that, or don't we? So, and just few more footnotes just before we proceed further, is that this last sentence, that in his teaching, referring to Bentini again, he seems to suggest it's a big game or play, and we have utter freedom to choose and create outcomes, and that there is only ourself to blame if life circumstances do not please us. Well, this could be looked upon from two perspectives. One perspective, let's say, is that indeed there is a choice. There is always a choice. There's a choice that is available when something in the field of all potentialities, even when something coming to us and then seemingly looks like we have no choice over it, we'd have to just accept it and go over it. There is still that choice. The choice here is in the way we approach any circumstances or any situation in life. That in itself is a choice. So the choice is fight, flight, or freeze, if you will, or to go with the flow. So there is a choice. Another view or another perspective on this last sentence is that indeed it is only the self, and funny enough the self is spelled here from the capital S, is to be blamed for all circumstances that do not please us. And with that I cannot agree more. Who is there to blame? It's only ourself, the Godhead. We cannot blame anyone else. So whichever way we look at it, it's the self in us that is the only doer, and yet it does not act. This is the verse from the Bhagavad Gita, a bewildering paradoxical verse, but it's a beautiful reconciliation. It does not, the individual consciousness, the individuality, assigns all its actions to the absolute, because there is only one doer, the self, and yet it's not involved. What it means, it's not involved. It's not involved in the drama of the karmic repercussions. It's not involved because the self obviously cannot produce karma. It's an oxymoron. It's untainted by what happens on the level of the waves. It's untainted on the level of particles and atoms and the myriad of creation of how it expresses itself. But this needs to be understood once and for all, and accepted once and for all, so that there is this very clear understanding that we are and we are not, simultaneously and all at once, as pure awareness, as an embodiment of the self, as an embodiment of pure consciousness. We are the only doers, or I am the only doer, and yet I am not involved. Sit with that. Contemplate on that. That's a koan in itself. I am the only doer, yet I am not involved. So that in itself addresses or answers the question of free will. Does it exist, and to what degree? So what is the free will? What is the place of free will here? It can only be applied to each respective platform of consciousness where it rests, you see? There is no such thing as speaking of free will as such. It doesn't exist. There's no free will independently from where that free will applies and to what degree of embodiment or to what degree of self-realization. So for the one who abides as the self at all times, there is complete oneness with any willing, because there is nothing that is separate. And there's often this been said that in a state of unity, or state of unity is characterized by absence of desires to go anywhere. Because you cannot go from here to here. You're already there. Wherever you are intending to go, you cannot go anywhere because the circumference falls back into its center. You see? But it is connected here in a very, very subtle way. In what way it is connected, and how it is connected. And why do people, let's say, who abide in that state still go and perform duties in life? Well, this is another matter. This is a very different matter. And this is perhaps that brings the question that within that there's still something operable. Within consciousness there's always something operable, there's something operates. At each respective level something is at play, something is at work. Always. It cannot be otherwise. Each energy counteracts another energy so that the balance is sustained. Hence, in the one who abides in that state, though there is, let's say, what could be called as motiveless state, there comes a necessity to express. To express what? To express that which then upholds other layers of that which obviously not separate from the overall realization of that being one with everything at all times, beyond time, beyond space, beyond causation. So the question of free will is a grand question to which we will keep going back. To me, that question is encapsulated in that line which I chose to present in the Science and Non-Duality conference, and which I will keep returning in the coming years. The world is as you see it. In other words, the way we perceive reality is what makes that reality as it is. Not that reality is as it is independently from us as perceivers, as some teachers actually trying to convey. Reality does not exist outside of my perception of it. This is a revolutionary, radical understanding. In other words, there is no Shiva outside of me. And there is no me outside of Shiva. As the one who is embedded with perception, I am forever in that companionship. And that companionship is succulently expressed through the very notion of the first tattva as Shakti, the primal one, the pure tattva. Undifferentiated reality of Shiva becomes Shiva-Shakti principle. And that Shiva-Shakti principle could be traced down to elementary order of creation, to anything that happens anywhere in any corner of the universe. Hence could be worked with from any level. And that's what the Shaiva tantric traditions utilize from the start. Accept everything as your own expression. Everything from the start. Rather than denying, rather than rejecting, it's not a neti-neti approach. Not this, not this. No, it's a very different approach. To me, this approach goes further. This approach actually takes it further. It's accepting everything from the start, rejecting nothing. Because there is nothing outside of my perception. The world does not exist as it is. It can only exist as I perceive it. It's another koan for you to contemplate. This world does not exist independent from my perception. This world is the projection of my perception, and I'm always one with it. Hence there is no Shiva without me, and there is no me without Shiva. You see how Jiva and Shiva beautifully realigned. And that realignment is done through the property of Shakti. It is the Shakti that does that realignment. The property of Shiva as motion, as dynamism, brings back even Shiva back to itself. That sacred feminine that we've started this sharing today. That sacred feminine that is behind this process.